Welcome to the evolution of work. My name is Jens Rinnelt, and I'm going to talk today about the evolution of work, how our management thinking has evolved over time, and also what are the belief systems that have evolved um, in this regard, and also how is this then manifested in the way of how we design and structure organizations. I believe this is an important topic to talk about because it helps us to better understand what drives actually an organization, what drives the intention and thinking behind when we design organizations, and how can we intentionally choose between different ways, worldviews, thought systems, and essentially organizational designs, and thereby go into a direction that is best for the world. And the question then, of course, is what is this direction and what are ways that are supportive in going into this direction that is best for the world? And I hope with my presentation today, I can give some insights, provide some clarity, and most of all, I hope to inspire thought leaders or organizations to apply this way of thinking, to apply the models that I will present and talk about in order to create socially sustainable and healthy workplaces that create nurturing environments for employees, and in that way provide spaces for a regenerative way of doing business that is beneficial for our planet, for the people on our planet, and essentially for the organization's survival in itself. So, the evolution of work. Where do we start when we talk about the evolution of work? Let's start basically in the beginning of time, the beginning of humanity. And although that might sound very distant from where we are right now, we don't actually have to go back that far in time. We only have to go back around 300,000 years ago. And what you can see is in the beginning of time, when basically the Homo sapiens has been entering planet Earth as a species, we have been living in hunter and gatherer tribes. And I want you to, for a second, imagine how this must have been to follow your food, to basically live a nomadic lifestyle, travel around in order to find places where you can rest and dine. What we also can see in these indigenous tribes and cultures is that there is predominantly a sexual division of labor, where men mostly hunt and women raise children. This doesn't imply that this is a suitable state for our current times, but this is simply how we as humanity have started, simply because our biological prerequisites have been enabling us to do that. So how has work been organized in these tribes of around 100, 150 people, where everybody kind of knew everyone else in the tribe. So the first thing that you notice is that there is a high level of trust, because there are only about 150 people in your tribe. You will probably know all of them by face-to-face recognition. And if you then think about how they went out, a group of people, to actually hunt for food, it is based on individual people, individual humans taking the initiative based on the task that is to be performed. And the decision making is very much in harmony with nature. It is basically serving for the higher good, which means in that case, the survival of the tribe. And normally in these kind of tribes, there is not one leader or one decision maker, but it is more a collective decision, and it can happen very spontaneously based on the situation the group of people, the group of hunters and gatherers is facing. So what this kind of tells us is that even though we nowadays talk about new ways of organizing work, about new styles of leadership, it has already been there 300,000 years ago with the beginning of humanity. If we talk about situational leadership, about participatory decision making, these are all things that have been there from the beginning of time. So in a way, it is not really new ideas, but it's more a remembering of where have we actually started from, and what was the belief systems behind that that enabled us to live in such a harmonic way with nature. And if you look at the organization of work, I'm just putting this field down so you can see it. It is basically a survival mode. The value creation mode is based on survival. So you can say on one hand, there's an individual, there's a randomly input based on the circumstances that the tribe faces when they go out hunting. And the individual peoples in the collective tribe make decisions and produce the value. In that case, they slaughter an animal, they pick berries in order to feed and sustain the tribe. And the output, if you want to call it like this, is basically directly consumed. And the surplus that is achieved is equally shared among everyone in the tribe. And it's everybody's responsibility to contribute to the tribe and to the survival of the tribe. And actually, this picture is a little bit misleading because it assumes it is a linear way of living. So on the one hand, you have an input, then there's the value creation process, and on the other side, you have the output. But essentially, it is, as I said before, a very harmonistic, a very circular way of living with the world, where everything the tribe consumes is basically transformed into nourishment for the earth again. And that nourishment for the earth creates new life in the form of animals, fruits, which again serve as the basis nutrition for the tribe. So that's what I mean with a circular way and a harmonic living of man in nature. And why is this happening? Or what is the belief system behind that? Is basically that the people at that time believe in the natural spirits. Everything in life had a specific purpose. People it is a very mystical worldview, and the humans in these tribes believed that essentially God created, or not even God, that there is a spiritual aspect to their being, and this is harmonic with the spiritual aspects in everything that they encountered, may it be in plants, in animals, in all the elements of life. Then we are moving on to we can call it the first, not, we can call it the pre-industrial time, because it is in a way an industrial revolution, but it is at the same time it is basically the first agrarian revolution, which takes place 10,000 BC. And what determines this first agrarian revolution is the development of tools that allow for settling down, for agricultural work, and for actually growing plants, and for cultivating plants and dominating animals in order to ensure that nutrition and food can be grown. But this development reaches its peak basically in the second agrarian revolution between 1770 and 1880. In between this huge time span from 300,000 years before Christ until basically 250 years ago, we see a rise of many societies, for example, the Egyptians, the Roman Empire, and so forth. But at the same time, we also see their that they break down. And so essentially we can still speak about the same time area, the same time frame that is classified as a pre-industrial time. And this unprecedented increase in agricultural production takes place the most in Britain. And as I said, this is due to the development of new techniques, and an increase in labor and in land productivity, especially in the late 17th and 19th centuries. And what that allowed is that the agricultural output grew faster than the population over the time leading up to this 19th century. And that allowed for the first settlement of humans. And the organization of work is basically can be described as a craftsmanship. It is also sometimes called a putting out system. Most people work at a farm at these times. That means there is a specific input in the form of resources, of labor, of tools. And the work is performed, the value is created basically by the individual person. And he or she produces an output, and that excess can be sold to other farms, can be sold to people who have the money to buy it. And in that way, we see the rise of craftsmanship. We see the rise of individual people pursuing more nuanced professions of work, so to say. It allows a specialization, and it is basically the foundation for trademarks in that time. And the belief systems here is that God has created the world, and God has created a specific order, predetermined classes. So that means, for example, if you have been born a farmer, your destiny in life is to be a farmer. If you have been born into a different class, for example, a fisherman, this is probably the occupation that you will do for the rest of your life. If we move on, then we enter the scientific revolution. And what we see in this scientific revolution is that it is pretty much dominated from a heliocentric worldview, which you can see on the bottom left side. It is basically the assumption that the world is in the center of the universe. The Earth is, in the center of the universe, and that the gods are in heaven above the sky. And what this scientific revolution brings us is actually a demystification from gods and from the spiritual world. The most famous quote from that time is probably René Descartes' famous quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. Building on the work of Copernicus, Galilei, and Isaac Newton basically comes up with a fundamental description of how the universe works by providing us with the Newtonian laws of physics. And this all leads to a very rational worldview that triggers an enormous understanding of how the world functions, and it allows a huge increase in efficiency. And this huge increase in efficiency is can be observed by the invention of the steam engine in the 1760s. And as you can see on the bottom right side, exactly around that time, the production per person is dramatically increasing. And this rise in efficiency in production, which is also classified by the formation of organizations, brings a huge raise in life quality to the overall population. And with that come things like the first free and mandatory school, which is opened in Sweden in 1842. The formation of large trade conglomerates like the East Indian Company. And as you can see on the left side, huge factory towns like Manchester, which is at that time called Cottonopolis. So how does the organization of work look in a factory? It is, again, you have an input on the one side, and then you have a standardized way of production that is performed still by individual persons, but these people are streamlined into specific standardized way of producing value. And together they form an organization. And in that way, they also produce reliable and standardized output. And again, the excesses, especially financial excesses that the output produces, are reinvested into the organization in order to increase the level of output. Another huge invention during that time is the invention of the combustion engine, the light bulb, and the telephone. And it is hugely affecting industries like the oil, steel, and electricity. And especially the synergies between these individual industries lead to new production methods, inventions in different industries, and they accelerate a rapid growth. For example, in America, in the 1880s, 75,000 miles of railroads are laid, which allow previously isolated production places to be connected, which is ultimately leading to globalization. And the most prominent example of the assembly line is probably Henry Ford, which you can see with his model in the lower middle picture, is revolutionizing the way of how a standardized product is produced, and thereby allowing a huge population access to basically the automobile. With that growth in efficiency and in productivity, companies grow, and so this raises actually the need for the first organizational chart from the railroad accounting company, which you can see on the right, where all the different departments that now span across whole America in some way have to be managed, have to be categorized, and this is the foundation for the first organizational chart. The management thinking also starts basically at that time, and the foundation for most of the thinking is created by Adam Smith, who writes his huge work, The Wealth of Nations. And he basically has two main points, which is on the first one hand, the division of labor. So he says that we need division of labor in order to allow for specialization in different industry, in different occupations. And the second aspect that he mentions is that of the invisible hand. What that basically means is that under that if you pursue your self-interest and compete with other people in your environment, this will ultimately lead to a state of equilibrium. This is also often referred to as the demand and supply side of a market. Another management thinker that has a huge influence at that time is a German, Max Weber, and maybe that's where the German interest or likingness of bureaucracy comes from, because he's basically advocating an authority hierarchy, basically a chain of command from one leader towards the team leaders, towards the supervisors, towards the employees, which creates the typical way of looking at an organization in a as a pyramid. He also advocates job specialization, and he advocates that all aspects of an organization, all the roles and all the functions are basically disenchanted and are very rationalized. This is in line with the thinking of that time, with a very rational approach. And which you can see in the last point, where he also advocates that career advancement, that you can make climb the corporate ladder, so to say, that you are not restricted by the occupational class that you are born into, but by doing good deeds, by doing hard work, you can actually climb out of this class system and advance in your career. At the same time, this advancement is purely based on technical qualifications. Basically looking at how good are you at doing your work? What is the competencies that you bring? And it should not be about who you know. It should not be a way of getting a favors from maybe a person who likes you and that can help you to get into the organization. It is purely based on the technical qualifications. The probably most famous management thinker of that time is Frederick Winslow Taylor, with his scientific way of managing. And he basically lies the foundation for a separation of planning and operation. He basically creates a division between management and workers. And let me quote here one of his quotes in order to make you understand what he's advocating. It is only through enforced standardization of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, and enforced cooperation that this faster work can be assured. And the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing this operation rests with management alone. So basically, he creates a separation between the blue-collar worker and the white-collar worker. Although he is often criticized for his radical implementation of scientific management, what he's ultimately after is reducing waste in the way production is run, and basically trying to achieve that through task performance and optimization. And that is what he studies. He studies basically the motion work of people, because at that time in the factories, most of the work is still done per hand. So he optimizes how fast is one person being able to put a tool from A to B, and what can we do to motivate that worker to work faster by optimizing the motions that he does. So he's basically claiming that the less motion the worker has to perform, the more efficient he will be. Another management thinker that is related to administrative management is Henri Fourier, around the time of 1841 to 1925. And he's also advocating a classical top-down management, a basic planning of where we are and where do we want to go, and setting goals and asking who needs to be involved to get there. Then providing the right materials, delegating the authority to the right people, commanding, which he understands as knowing the strengths and weaknesses and motivation of personnel, and then coordinating and control which is harmonizing the activities, communicate, and receive feedback. At the same time, he's also advocating and sees an interrelation between individual and organizational interests. As in what I've just mentioned, trying to understand the strengths of the weaknesses, he's actually taking a quite human-centric approach to management. But we will get to that in a second. What this way of standardized production allows is actually mass production. And that is quite observable in, for example, the picture on the left, where you have the same product being produced over and over again. And by optimizing the organization internally, you are able to produce more output into the market. No matter if the market actually requires your product or not. The focus is so much in the internal organization and optimizing this organizational machine to be run. And that we can see in, for example, interchangeable parts, continuous production, a rationalized factory layout, modern business enterprise. These are just some of the keywords that all stem from the same understanding of how can we run an organization in a more efficient way. And the organization of work at that time is basically classified by the division of labor and by the introduction of management. So again, we have a certain input on the one hand side of the organization, but now we can see that the work is still being performed by individual people in a standardized way, but because the organizations are growing and it is perceived as that there needs to be control about for these workers, we have the introduction of management that oversees the activities and tries to motivate workers, tries to implement standard ways of production, and tries to implement benefits that actually motivate the employee to work in a more efficient way. And that again leads to output, which again finances the more efficient way of running an organization. And that's the classical definition also of capitalism, is that you invest the capital that you gain back into your organization in order to, for the next time, actually, the next time you run this circle, you create more value, or you create, differently expressed, more output, which allows you to make more money. We then enter a different area of management, which is basically, as I already mentioned, a more human-centric way of looking at employee engagement, looking at employee motivation. So one of the great thinkers here is George Elton Mayo, in the time from 1880 till 1949. And he's often called the father of human relations. He sees organizations as social systems with informal subcultures. And he puts a lot of emphasis on the individual and the group relationships in the workplace. So he moves away from a purely activity-based organization and activity-based optimization more towards how are these activities relating to each other, and how is the social aspect between two people that perform a task, how is that relationship, how does it look like, this pattern, and how can we optimize it? So he starts to apply understandings from psychology and sociology into the organization and looks at individual and group behaviors, for example. And he pays more attention to the emotional side of how people experience their way of working. How do people feel when they come to work? And that is what he believes is the most rewarding, motivating factor besides being simply more efficient. And as it's said on the slide, he pays attention to the physical conditions of work, the wages that is paid to the worker, as well as the employee satisfaction. And what he discovers, for example, in his famous Hawthorne experiments, is that groups without supervisors interference actually set higher goals and are more productive than if they are when they have a supervisor. Another famous thinker of that time is Douglas MacGregor and his human relations and motivational theory. You have probably heard of theory X and theory Y. The theory X assumption is that the employee is basically demotivated, dislikes work, and therefore has to be motivated in order to do his job and be efficient. Where on the other hand, the theory Y assumes that every employee is intrinsically motivated, seeks responsibility, and wants to take responsibility and make decisions in a self-directed way. And what is interesting is that even though Douglas MacGregor has written a book on this topic, where he basically states from the beginning to the end that this is just an image, a narrative that we create when we look at employees, because it is often quite easy to observe people in their work environment and see that they are taking breaks, and from that he concludes we make the assumption that they are not motivated to work. But if that would be really true, how could we actually explain that a disengaged employee, after he finishes his work, goes to his sport club and becomes a very engaged and responsibility seeking and taking volunteer in his sport club? Another great thinker of that time is Kurt Lewin, and he basically introduces the resistance to change as a systemic concept that he says is a force that applies to managers and employees equally. But because the terminology and not the context was carried forward, it later becomes basically our understanding that there is a resistance to change that applies, first of all, only to employees, and that there is a huge resistance to change. And his three-stage change process is to say that we have to unfreeze the resistance to change, then change it, and then freeze again the systemic behaviors in an organization. Finally, the first woman that makes it into the round of great management thinkers is Mary Parker Follett, and she is introducing basically lateral processes within hierarchical organization. What that means is, whereas before the command and control and the way of communication has been going from the top to the bottom, she says that there is also communication sideways between teams that enable actually value creation processes. And DuPont in the 1920s is one of the first matrix style organizations. And due to her way of thinking and due to DuPont's way of organizing at that time, the company is actually able to sustain the deep depression that is going on at that time. She also coins the term win-win, and she basically advocates that we should work with the employee, that we should work with the manager. So she says power with instead of power over someone. Another of the probably well-known management thinkers is Peter Drucker. He has lived from 1999 to 2005, and he is famous for management by objective. He also terms the term knowledge worker, and he also fits into the human relations category of management thinkers, because he advocates that employees are seen as assets and not as liabilities. He also advocates decentralization and simplification. During that time, also in the 1960s, the first participatory processes develop. Another huge influence during that time, already starting in the early 19th century until actually the late 19th century, is the design thinking. What that means is that where we have seen previously a way of working that is dominated by mass production, we now see a movement into a direction of seeing an object in relation to its environment. So what that means is, for example, that designers think about how is my product actually being used by a buyer, and that enables a totally different dynamic. Instead of simply pushing your mass or standardized product into the market, you start to engage with potential buyers, and you try to understand their needs. You have a dialogue with potential buyers that identifies actually how could your product be specialized and individualized to the needs of an individual person. Something that is maybe also of interest to mention here is, for example, the way of how science looks at design thinking versus how architecture looks at design thinking. Science is often looking at a problem based solution or a problem focused solution, whereas architecture is more looking at how can we design a solution that actually enables the participant and the user actually of the finalized house or building or product, how to make use of it. So it's more a solution based focus instead of looking at what problem are we trying to solve. The way of working and the way of creating value at that time is, as I said before, a matrix style organization. We can also see the beginning of project management to arise, and project management is often used for managing innovative processes. That means, how can we create a safe environment to test new products, new markets? How can we find a way that is not the standardized way of production? And this is a first step based upon the relations between different people in an organization. It is the first step away from silo ways of managing organizations, more towards cross-functional teams, cross-functional relationships within the organization. At the same time, the same principle applies. There is input in the form of resources, knowledge, and there's an output in the form of products and services on the other side. Then we enter the digital revolution. It's the revolution of knowledge in the 1960s. And this is marked by the intervention of the semiconductor, personal computers, and the internet. And it is affecting industries, for example, consulting, education, entertainment, financial planning, all of those service sectors that depend heavily on knowledge work, knowledge creation, and knowledge distribution. With that revolution, it is really a revolution because knowledge or data now becomes a commodity. Before, only raw materials and production have been the aspects that define success, as defined as the success factors of an organization. Now a third dimension comes into play, and that is knowledge. And it really is a paradigm shift, because this information availability through, for example, the internet brings a huge risk for rigid and established structures, because it allows for power structures to be dispersed, because people are simply more educated and have access to knowledge. This is no surprise that it leads to an empowerment of workers in skills and knowledge. What we can also see is a more network society that is hugely influenced by systems thinking and a huge servitization of products. One of the leading management thinkers of that time is Edwards Deming, and he demands or advocates focus on quality and instead of only quantity. He lays basically the foundation for continuous improvement in organizations. He wants to drive out fear in organizations, because that is one of the key factors that hinder innovation. He strongly advocates to institute leadership instead of only managing by numbers. As we've seen before, he advocates breaking down of silos, and he says that transformation is everyone's job. Based upon this, we have certain methodologies that evolve, which is based on this Kaizen philosophy, the way of continuous improvement. For example, total quality management, the plan, do, check and act circle, the lean way of managing, as for example seen in Toyota, the Six Sigma method, which is was made famous by Motorola, or a statistical process analysis. And this is basically saying that we need to plan for an improvement, then do it, and after we have done it, we reflect on what result has it created for us, and then this result or this way of reflection basically creates an input for new planning, doing, checking, and action. Again, reflection circle that continues over time. And therefore, it is called continuous improvement. With David Copperwriter in 1945, we see a dramatic change in how we actually look at organizations, because he asks what gives life to organizations. And whereas we have before always looked at what is not efficient, what can be improved, what is basically deficient, he asks what is working in an organization and how can we amplify this? How can we look at the things that are working, the strengths an organization has, and how can we accelerate this? How can we talk about it and how can we spread it in an organization? This is also based on his view that an organization is simply a social constructed way of a group of people working and relating together. And his way of change is identified or classified by improving the communication patterns between people and thereby changing the organizations through conversations. The organization of work is now classified as a network organization. What that means is that on the periphery, direct customer contact is enabled. So the employee, the service representative, for example, has direct customer contact. And through the dialogue with the customer, he gains input in the form of knowledge, which he can use, take back to the organization, and in that way improve the way of working and improve the processes that are in place. Still, we see a separation between management and workers, where management is still in the center holding the strings together, and the workers are doing the work on an external level, on the almost periphery of the organization. And one of the beliefs that is driving this way of organizing is that no man is an island, that servant leadership is, for example, a keyword that is often coming in these times. What is also driving the belief system here is that there is an internal way of organizing and an external customer that has to be served. Then we enter the industry 4.0, which is actually quite a recent development. This term has been coined at the Hanover Fair in 2011. So it's quite a new way of seeing the way we organize and create value through, for example, the Internet of Things, for example, augmented reality. And that means that platforms or artificial systems can directly communicate with each other, and in that way just-in-time delivery is enabled. Different advances in technology can be observed, and this development basically leads to the blurring division between the physical, the biological, and the digital line, which you can see with the woman riding the bicycle with an augmented reality glasses on. So what is still reality, and what is technological implied? At that time, as I said before, systems theory is also a huge influence factor. There are some of the famous thinkers listed here, for example, Stafford Beer, Peter Senge, Russell Ackoff. They all stand for modern way of management. And they basically say that every system has its subsystem, and each of those have an individual purpose. So what we see is that besides the activity focus and the relational focus, we now understand that each team, each person in that system has a specific purpose, a specific reason for existence. And all of these individual systems are in an ecosystem or in an organization are competing for various objectives. What systems theories also advocates is that they are adaptive open systems and that they can change by adjusting to changes in their environment through input, output, feedback processes with the environment. Another theory that has a huge influence is contingency theory, and that is basically describing the interrelation between subsystems and the environment. It basically says that there is no standardized way of looking at one organization and taking the success factors of this organization and applying it in another organization, because every system, every organization is context dependent. Every organization, every system is individualistic and therefore requires a unique and individualized way of looking at the organization and of handling change or dealing with specific issues in that given context. The organization of work and the way of creating value is based on co-creation and self-management. So what you can see is, first of all, an increase in tasks, a higher level of responsibility for the individual person, because the management functions are basically carried out by the individual person. So one could say that the one person is now at the same time the worker and the manager, and therefore has an increased responsibility. And this person organizes himself in alignment with other people through the relationship with other people, and that forms the foundation for self-management. And again, this self-managed way of organizing is dependent on the external environment, on the customer, and through the interaction with the customers, learning and the selling of services and products is created. The beliefs are here that there is a codependency of the individual person, of the organization with its environment, and only through co-learning and co-creation the way forward can be achieved. The last aspect that we can see, and I think that represents again a huge shift, paradigm shift, is the development of human services. Some people call these the gift economy or the purpose economy, and name these people working in these service areas the gold collar workers. And why are they called the gold collar workers? Because they focus on creating improved conditions for certain parts of a society. For example, for empowering youth. What is specific for these people and for these organizations is that they are defined by a high level of autonomy. They see a person as a whole, and they take a holistic perspective on how can solutions look like. They are advocating life-affirming and regenerative processes for people and the planet. And ways of doing this is the circular economy, for example, and sharing economies. Things that, as we have seen in the beginning of the presentation, have been there from the beginning of time. And what I found interesting is that the digitalization and technologization simultaneously brings forward the question of what makes us actually human. And the value creation is by, if I benefit you, I also benefit me by increasing the systemic conditions and life on Earth. If I create value for my environment, I also create value for myself because I improve my own conditions for living on this planet. We have seen that there is again a rise in spirituality, the rise that goes away from a purely materialistic perspective towards believing into a metaphysical perspective, in valuing the inner experiences of people, becoming more in touch with emotions. And at the same time, there is scientific proof that we are all on an atomic level, basically the same energy. The organization of work in this circular or gig economy is determined again by an individual person who has a lot of autonomy, self-organization, but there is actually not a difference between who am I and what is my environment. I am at the same time the whole. I am an individual person, but I'm at the same time the whole. And as I said before, by increasing conditions for life on Earth, I'm not only increasing life for myself, but also for the systemic system and the whole system on planet Earth. So what we have talked about can be classified in the classic approaches of management. And there you can see the evolution of management thinking. So in the classic approaches, we had the administrative management, the bureaucratic management, scientific management, which was, as I said before, very activity-based focus. Then we had neoclassical approaches, which are determined by the human-centric way of working, human relations and behavioral science. And that focuses more on who are we working with. So it's more the relationship aspect between two activities, between two people. Then we see the modern approaches to management, which are based on quantitative approaches, systems theory, contingency theory, and they focus more on a context level. So why are we actually doing this work? Why does a specific function exist in a system? And another evolutionary step that we can see here is what I would determine as meta-modern approaches. They are based on metaphysical and quantum physics, going back to basically quality production instead of simply quantitative production, an increase in handcrafts that is going back to the roots, so to say. And the focus here is based on community. Again, how can I create a systemic patterns and conditions that are life and affirming? So the question here is, for what am I actually working? And to finish off this presentation, I want to give you 3 ways of looking at what are maybe the biggest challenges nowadays for organization. And that is the decrease of standardized value creation and an exceptional increase in personalized value creation. So that green part can also be seen as dealing with complexity, finding innovative ways of going forward. That a lot of organizations that have been focused on mass production currently struggle with. Another aspect is, who is this responsibility? We have seen that before, in the beginning of time, the responsibility was with God or nature. Then we have seen the development going to a societal level and later on to an organizational level. And nowadays, it seems to be that the sole responsibility lies in the individual person to take responsibility for changing the way we are working and to change the way we are living. And last but not least, is there an evolution of consciousness? Can we look at how organizations evolve in time, and how can we look at and see how we look at an organization? For example, the physical me, which is described as red paradigm in Ken Wilber or spiral dynamics. If you're familiar with Frederick's Laloux work, then this is familiar to you. The organization in that paradigm is basically seen as God's work. God is equally as the boss or leader in that paradigm. So we follow basically the leader's command. Then we see a formal we in the amber or orange categorization, where we look at an organization as a machine, where we can simply replace parts of an organization, which is the classical activity-based focus. Then we see the green paradigm, which can be classified as a creative together. So we take care of each other. It's a very relationship-based focus, which is basically looking at an organization as a family. Then the teal paradigm, which we have described here as consciousness united, where an organization is seen as a living system and also moving in an arising area, an arising level of consciousness, where we look at an organization as a web of life. So there is really no separation between internal and external world, because I am part of the whole. And by improving my own conditions on life, and by increasing my way of working, I'm also increasing the systemic patterns in the world. So to give you some practical tools, what can you do? What kind of questions can you ask yourself or as an organization? For example, as a human, you can ask the career, if you're following a career path, you can ask, what activity am I good at? Then you can ask the relationship aspect, who can help me? Who do I want to work with? Then why do you do actually your work? And why is this relevant to other people? And last but not least, what gives you life? What gives you meaning? On the business aspect is that, are we actually congruent in the way we do activities, in the way we relate to other people, in the way of who are we in our identity and context, and also how do we contribute to our environment and the community that we are part of. And then what are appropriate tools, methods, or approaches for the specific challenges and for the given context that we have. And last but not least, what works well and who can share a positive example or a story in your organization. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. My name is Jens Rinnelt. I'm business humanizer and co-creator, and you can find me at humanbusiness.eu or at emprogage.com. My work is driven by my mission, which is inspiring to evolve. And I hope with that, we can embark on an organizational evolutionary journey. Thank you very much, and reach out if you have any questions or comments.